All right, well, we're going to wrap things up here with just a final discussion. I think it's been a very rich 3 days. Thank you to each of you for being here. Thank you to each of you who has presented. There's been such a wonderful diversity of papers with so much to think about and consider as we walk away from this. So I just want to say thank you. All right, so what we're going to do here in the last, just to close out, is I'm going to give each of the keynote speakers a chance, just a few minutes, about 5 minutes each, just to sort of say some closing remarks about their experience here, or about theology and the arts generally, and about what they're thinking about as they leave this symposium. So we'll sort of go down the line, give them each 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up for just a bit of general conversation, and then we'll say goodbye. How does that sound? All right, so we're just going to go in the order of the keynotes: Kevin, Amaryah, and William. So Kevin.
Thank you. I think generally that this is a good time for religion and the arts. I think we're in a liminal position that religion and the arts for the last, 20, 25 years has been pretty much concerned with themes and has been one of those academic areas where people go when they're feeling too fatigued to do anything else. But I think that's starting to change, and it's starting to become one of the most interesting and vital and challenging areas. And of course there are many different ways into it. There's no single way into it, and there are various things that one might asterisk, some of which I've mentioned while I've been here, but I'll just recap a couple of those. Obviously, what I talked about in my own lecture on spiritual exercises, which I think is the first time it's been applied to poetry, and of course it can be applied to all of the arts in different ways, and with perhaps different conclusions than the ones that I have come to. Another thing which I've written on in my book Poetry and Revelation is on the theory of literary or artistic composition in terms of quasi-sacramentals, that I was mentioning in response to William's paper, namely that the sacraments, the artworks are not in themselves sacraments, but they are sacramentals. That's to say, they are ways in which God can come into the world. And this has got not only interest if one's a producer of art or a consumer of art, but it's also got very significant theological repercussions and pastoral repercussions. There are some people who find it hard to read scripture. And as Karl Rahner, who was mentioned just recently, said that all Christians must learn how to read poetry before they can read scripture. For the obvious reason, most of the Hebrew scripture is poetry. The New Testament is a rather prosaic series of documents by comparison, apart from what Jesus says. The other thing, again, my own notion that I've written about a little bit, is that of the iconic moment. In other words, where there's a sudden crossing of the gazes, and one's own gaze is called into question by the divine or something which is standing in the place of the divine. And also, I might add, it's not simply in the service of Christianity. This occurs in atheistic texts too. My favourite French novelist of the last century, after Proust, Maurice Blanchot, does this all the time, where he has a certain blankness stare back at the reader, which is rather disturbing. There's a whole lot of things I guess I could continue on and say, but I know some of you always like to go back, we all like to go back with a book to read or an author to follow up on who might be useful. One I would recommend, because most people I know interested in religion and the arts, when they read this person, find themselves energized by him and go in various directions after reading him, is Jean-Louis Chrétien, whose surname is a gift from God, as it were. Jean-Louis Christian. That's very memorable. His book, Call and Response, or The Arc of Speech, The Gaze of the Bible, there's quite a few in English now, and there's an enormous number in French, and his French is very beautiful. So he's someone certainly to have a look at.
Thank you. I guess what I want to say is about the relationship between practice and pedagogy, and I thought Catherine's presentation was really helpful for thinking about the relationship between pedagogy and things like colonialism and racism, etc. But I've been thinking a lot with Hortense Spillers, who's a Black feminist literary scholar and theorist, and she has this essay called Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, and she kind of relates the situation of the Black creative intellectual, that's what she calls it, to Black artists. And so I just had some thoughts about that essay that I've been thinking over and over, and so it's kind of short, so I thought I would just read some of that. What is the relationship between practice and the assembly of an ensemble, between the instructive performative excellence of Black musicians and the object of study for the Black intellectual? The link between practice and ensemble, between preparation or study and play in Spiller's essay, brought to mind a Cecil Taylor documentary, All the Notes. And Cecil Taylor is like an avant-garde Black jazz musician. He passed away a few months ago, actually. But in this documentary, he has some comments on practice, technique, and composition that I find pertinent to Black study. So he says, "You practice so you can invent. Discipline? No. The joy of practicing leads you to the celebration of the creation. Creation is what it's about, not technique. You use technique to make the statement, but the statement must be out of what you have discovered in your preparation. How does a musician prepare himself? He prepares his senses to understand sound. How does a dancer dance? By training the senses in the body, by using the muscles. How does a painter paint? She trains her visual muscles to see. What is composition, but nothing more than having people recognize the organizational palette out of which they draw?" These comments illuminate some questions at the heart of Spiller's essay. How does the Black creative intellectual prepare herself? By training her senses to perceive and to produce knowledge. And this composition of knowledge must come from the organizational palette of one's own situation as a Black person in both the dominant anti-Black world and the multiplicity of the Black life world. What Spillers outlines here in the relationship between reading, writing, teaching, and the self is an economy of practices wherein the question at the heart of Black studies is also the question at the heart of the Black intellectual's position. Excavating the relationship between siding with the I and a siding of the I, like a situation of oneself or location of oneself, is the key. So what's the relationship between perception and one's situation? And how does that relate to preparation of one's senses to create intellectually or artistically? So in presenting the Black musician as instructive for a thought, Spillers forwards an idea of the practitioner of Black studies as one who practices with words in order to creatively intervene in the siding or perception of thought. And this intervention occurs through the siding of oneself, or how one's situatedness indexes something about the object of study, which is Black studies. And so part of what I've been thinking about with regards to this is how, what I think is interesting about Spillers is there's a refusal to kind of evade one's particular formation as a person, but also scholarly. So I think about myself, right? I came up through Amaryah and was trained by some Bardians and like post-liberal theology. And there was something compelling about that to me, even though it wasn't quite adequate to what I was trying to say. But I had to figure out how to use the skills I learned in reading that to say something that I was trying to say. So thinking about, what is it that the different situations we find ourselves in, what kind of materials we've learned to use or to play with, and how can we, through practices of attention, figure out how to retool whatever discourses or skills we have in order to try to create or say something different. And so I think about, for a situation of a black person in theology or a white person in theology trying to do something different, maybe than a kind of colonial mastery or something in relationship to art, then there's a kind of experimentation that can happen with a reading of oneself, and what kinds of resources or formations are indexed by your person, and how can you creatively retool those to try to do a different kind of theological experimentation.
Now, my thought about what we could all talk about together is how we think slant-wise differently. But in some way, we're all proposing different kinds of thinking slant-wise. I think is a well-chosen metaphor, and one that in various ways each of us, and I think the papers, the ones that I heard, would all be answering to that as well. Certainly Kevin's phenomenology is a way of reading slant-wise, and I think that Amaryah's critique of the common, or of human commonality as constituted by the slave, you presented it yourself very much as, is reading slant-wise. And I wanted to present my own commitment to the humanities and the liberal arts as a way of reading slant-wise and thinking slant-wise. And if we take that image, the slant is a thread connecting points that are no longer directly presented themselves and then tied together. There's something skewed about their relationship, and so we focus on the slant itself and the nature of the connection. We don't have fixed points or objects that we can grasp in themselves. We're really on that slant. It's a kind of immanence as well, thinking within a certain kind of immanence, but not at all a reduction, I don't believe, to immanence, to place ourselves on this slant between points that we've not been able to encompass. At the same time, it's really breaking that space, the slant, open to a kind of transcendence, a transcendence of any definition, any achieved objective status. So that's the kind of thinking that I wanted to pursue, and I do want to suggest that this is the kind of thinking we're engaged in generally in the humanities and the liberal arts, which depend on context, on relationship. We're always thinking in ways that are historical and personal as well. These are some of the distinguishing features of knowledge in the humanities. And I do think that they are all ways of thinking slant-wise rather than in a direct, objective mode. Now, we were also asked then to formulate a question for all of us to take away. And I would say that the question that was raised for me by the papers that I heard, I would say almost by all of them, is a question about the relation of popular culture, post-colonial critique to classical sources of theology and of literature, classical letters. How can we keep classical theological and literary sources in the curriculum and on the agenda if we should? I think this really is a question that we're all facing in education today. It's extremely powerful to explore the fresh sources, but do we need to have a dialogue with these voices from the past that have been part of the cultural baggage of generations, and do we want to in some way pursue that continuity as well, and as a basis really, and I would say a kind of a common basis with the proviso that this commonality is undefined. It's not a paradigm that has a definition. It's the very fact of being face to face with one another and trying to communicate without having either the content or the structure of that communication defined in advance. That is really the common, and it's an infinitely open common and uncommon. It's a commonality that needs to understand itself as uncommon as well.